these things constrict, and you'll sort of cough up or gag. Okay, and then, as I said, here's the part going into stylopharyngeus. In addition to innervating that, this is going to continue onward, and it's going to go to a bit of the soft palate up here, and general sensory to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Okay, so here you can actually dissect this. If you look in this area back over here where the palatine tonsil is, you can find the glossopharyngeal coming out of the back of the pharynx and going into the back of the tongue. And it is, in addition to carrying some general sensory back here, it's also carrying taste fibers, special sensory, so that all the taste from the back of the tongue and a little bit area around there goes back up through to the glossopharyngeal. So it's only about that long, but it gets a lot done and has lots and lots of branches. It does a wide variety of things. So here's a picture of the back of the tongue. Okay, there's the front of the tongue, which we will study in a couple of, I don't know, about a week and a half. I guess everything's in about a week and a half. And then this posterior part of the tongue receives general sensory and special sensory. So touch and taste and heat are all supplied by glossopharyngeal to this part. What supplies sensation to the front part? Right, lingual nerve. And what supplies taste to the front part? Quarter tympani traveling into the inlet. Good. Okay. And then finally, there's that branch I talked about, which is visceral sensory. It's carrying information back from this little carotid body, okay, which is a gas sensor. It tests what the blood contains, oxygen levels and carbon dioxide levels. And then from this carotid sinus, this bulge at the base of the internal carotid, which measures blood pressure going up towards the brain. So there's a lot to this nerve. Unlike the next one, at least it's all, within an area the size of a baseball, but it's very complicated. And there's the carotid body, which is a chemoreceptor, and then the carotid sinus, which is a pressure receptor. Okay, your old friend, the vagus, probably the first nerve you saw the spinal cord first, but the first cranial nerve you saw, your old friend. Coming off also right here, okay, right just behind the pons, and traveling out through the jugular foramen. So there's glossopharyngeal, there's vagus, the big broad one pictured there in the middle. Okay, and you'll remember when we dissected out the carotid sheath here in the neck, there was your common carotid coming up through the neck, your internal jugular coming down the cranium through the neck, and then wrapped in that same sheath was the vagus nerve. So there it is lying in the back of the carotid sheath between the internal jugular and the common carotid. Okay, it obviously does lots of things. This is the part you've learned a lot about before, but we're going to start at the other end. There are some branches of the vagus that go up into the back part of the cranium, the posterior cranial fossa. So the dura, lining the posterior cranial fossa and going up over that part of the brain, receives general sensory, it receives its general sensory innervation from the meningeal branch of the vagus. There's something called the auricular branch, which, as the name implies, provides general sensory to the skin behind the ear and also to the external auditory meatus. Not a terribly major part of sensation, but if you ever If you ever put a Q-tip in your ear, you're using your vagus to feel where it is. Okay, there's a pharyngeal nerve and palatal branches, which carries preganglionic parasympathetics to the mucosa of the pharynx. So the pharynx itself is sort of lined with mucosa. It's not dry. And also, this, as I mentioned earlier, this pharyngeal branch carries somatic motor to these muscles of the pharynx, and many of those to the palate. So those superior, middle, and inferior constrictor that I showed you in one of the earlier slides are getting their motor innervation from the vagus, and many of the other muscles in the back of the throat and the back of the mouth that we'll see in a little while also get their innervation. Okay. The internal branch of the superior laryngeal nerve. Okay, there is a superior laryngeal nerve that comes down more or less with the main, well, it can come off high and travel down with the other branch of the vagus. You see it right in the side of the throat, which the superior laryngeal nerve provides somatic motor, somatic sensory to the larynx above the vocal folds, okay, and somatic sensory and including taste to some little bitty areas in the back of the throat, the root of the tongue and the epiglottis. And you'll see the epiglottis. It's fairly trivial sensory compared to the other two, but there actually is some sensory that goes from further back. There's a sensory that we talked about from the glossopharyngeal. Further down the throat from that, there's a little bit of sensory and taste from vagus. And then there are preganglionic parasympathetics to mucosa of the larynx. We'll see the larynx in a few sections later. So the superior laryngeal has two branches. It has an internal branch, which sort of goes into the larynx. And then there's a little external branch, which comes off of the superior laryngeal and goes down and supplies somatic motor to the inferior pharyngeal constrictor and the cricothyroid muscle, a little bitty muscle on the side of the laryngeal apparatus that goes obviously from the cricoid cartilage to the thyroid cartilage. Now we're down to the stuff that you've already seen before. The main branch of the vagus obviously goes down into the thorax, and then it sends the recurrent laryngeal branch back up into the larynx. And this recurrent branch, which goes down into the thorax and comes right back up, supplies general sensory, or somatic sensory to the larynx below the vocal folds. Right? So the internal branch does sensory to the larynx above the vocal folds. The recurrent laryngeal gets the larynx below the vocal folds. And this recurrent laryngeal, hence the name, also supplies somatic motor to all of the muscles of the larynx that we'll see when we dissect the larynx, except for this cricothyroid, which gets innervation from the external branch of the superior laryngeal. And then the vagus continues down, as you saw in the first few weeks of the course, and carries preganglionic parasympathetics to all these thoracic and abdominal organs up as far as the left colic flexure. It's another busy one. Okay, so there's that meningeal branch, okay, which does a little bit of dura in the back of the posterior cranial fossa. The auricular branch, which does a little bit of sensory to part of the ear and the external auditory meatus. The pharyngeal nerve and its palatal branches, again, parasympathetics to mucosa of the pharynx and somatic motor to most of the muscles of the pharynx and most of the muscles of the palatal region. Okay, so here's the vagus coming down. This is sort of messed up. Here's the pharyngeal branch, which is going to these muscles of the pharynx and some of the areas of the soft palate. Okay. Here's the pharynx. This is a cross section, so these are these constrictors, okay, in the back of the pharynx there. Okay, and there they are wrapping around like that. Okay, and here are some of these little muscles of the pharynx, which you'll see in a later dissection when we do the back of the throat and the back of the mouth. But realize there's a whole bunch of little muscles. In addition to these big constrictors, there's a whole bunch of little muscles in the back of your mouth around the soft palate. Here are the constrictors again. And there's the vagus. Here's your carotid sheath would be right here, right? So there's your vagus, there's your common carotid, and there's your internal jugular. So this is the bits of the vagus and bits of the glossopharyngeal, as well as some sympathetics, all sort of joined together on the back of the pharynx to form a pharyngeal plexus. You can't tease one apart very easily because they're all joined up in there. The same way we saw these plexuses in the thorax and the posterior wall of the abdomen. Okay, so then there's the superior laryngeal nerve, which has an internal branch, which is sensory to the larynx above the vocal folds, and somatic and special sensory to the back end of the tongue and the epiglottis, and also parasympathetics to the mucosa of the larynx. So here's the superior laryngeal coming down, and there's the internal branch, which goes into this area here, known as the thyrohyoid membrane. So it's applying sensory to all this area around here, and then a little sensory and taste to the back of the tongue area that's behind there. This other branch of the superior laryngeal nerve is this one, which is the external branch, and it's going to this little muscle here that's connecting the cricoid cartilage and the thyroid cartilage. And there it is down there. Okay, so here's the external branch going down to this little muscle here. Okay, and the recurrent laryngeal, which is going down, as I said, into the thorax, turning around and coming back up. And there it is coming back up. Okay, and it's going into the larynx from below, where it's going to supply motor to all these laryngeal muscles, except for, see it coming up into here. There's your larynx up there. Okay, coming up. There's your trachea right there. It's coming up right beside the trachea. It's going to supply sensory below the vocal folds and motor to all the muscles except for that cricothyroid. Here it is from the other view. Okay, here's the right one. Remember that the left one goes under the arch of the aorta down there before it comes up. This one comes under the subclavian, right after the branch, after the subclavian and the carotid branch off. So you probably have seen both of these by now, and it's going back up into the larynx, which is back up in there. And then finally, there's all this stuff that you've seen before, the part that continues on after the recurrent comes back and goes into thoracic and abdominal viscera. Obviously, all the lungs and heart and livers and stomachs and duodenums and everything up until this left colic flexure, and parasympathetics from below that are coming from the sacral region. Okay, there's a lot going on in those two. This one's a lot easier. Number 11, spinal accessory or accessory. Comes out also through the jugular foramen, right? So you've got glossopharyngeal, vagus, and spinal accessory coming out of the jugular foramen. But you'll recall, you can see some parts of spinal accessory coming up through the foramen magnum and then going out through the jugular foramen. It's the one, the most inferior one there. And it's purely somatic motor, as far as we're concerned. Okay. And it supplies somatic motor to two muscles, sternocleidomastoid up here in front, right, forming the front part of the posterior triangle, and trapezius, the back part of the posterior triangle. That part that you see coming up through, it also picks up some parts from upper cervicals, which are proprioceptive fibers. It's not the motor part is the accessory, but by the time it gets out the jugular foramen, it's also carrying some proprioceptor fibers that come up from the net cervical region. And there it is again. So there's sternocleidomastoid, fibers going into sternocleidomastoid, and then it's traveling down into trapezius. And you probably saw it on both of those muscles. Okay, number 12, which you have very little contact with so far, but you probably saw it looping down there near the digastric on the underside of the mandible. So here's number 12, back over here. Okay. And the first three we've talked about exited the cranium through the jugular foramen. The hypoglossal has its own place to get out. It goes out through the hypoglossal canal. Okay? And it provides somatic motor to almost all of the intrinsic muscles of the tongue, except for palatoglossus and the intrinsic muscles of the tongue. So basically anything that moves the tongue, except for one called palatoglossus, is controlled by the hypoglossal nerve. Okay, now, there's some people who think this is a really great rule for learning all this stuff. There's some people who think it's not worth the effort. But there is a rule invented by the former chair of our department called Jack Stern for remembering. So if you can remember all this, you can remember 3 or 4 other things about what innervates a lot of these muscles in the back of the throat. Okay, so muscles that have the word tensor in them are innervated by the mandibular division of the trigeminal. And these are little muscles you'll see in later dissection called, well, you won't see tensor tympani, but you will see one called tensor veli palatina.